Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Stephen Greer. I'm here with Dr. Russell Targ, who is joining me for this uh, interesting evening discussion about remote viewing and the science of consciousness. And I'd like to thank Dr. Targ for being here with us. And a few introductory things before we get into the meat of this. First of all, thanks to everyone who has helped us with this project. We are now #1 worldwide on iTunes and a lot of other platforms for Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. Amongst all independent films, including ones with actors and big budgets, we're #4 in the world, which is very rare. So it's been a big adventure. We're now in the 4th week after the release, and we're still going strong due to you guys. So what I'm hoping everyone will continue to do is network this. We have a very limited, sort of budget for advertising. In fact, none to speak of. And so the word getting out through all of you as sort of our frontline people, ambassadors to the rest of the world, because we want to identify the 1% of the public who can begin to practice meditation and the path of the seer and have this big transformational effect within our civilization that can happen with this 1% quantum phase transition effect that we've spoken about and that we talk about in the movie. The other thing I'd like to thank everyone for, people who have been giving us feedback and fixes for the app, CE5 Contact app, if you go to the iTunes or Google store. And that is a number 2 or 3 in educational apps in the world right now. And you guys have helped make that possible. It's the way that you go from learning initially about this subject and seeing the movie to being able to really practice meditation, remote viewing, and how to organize a team where you go out under the stars and make contact together. And the third thing I want to just sort of remind folks of, we have a crowdfunding site at ce5film.com. Of course, we've obviously finished the funding and the film. The funds we're trying to raise now is to get the campaign stronger so that we can take this information to more and more people. There are some significant costs incurred for doing that, and we want to keep this going past May into June and July and the summer and on and on. So those of you who can help us with that, you can make any kind of contribution. And there are a lot of great incentive gifts for that, including, a download of the movie or the download of the special features and other books and meditation MP3 and other gifts. So if you go to ce5film.com, you'll see all the incentive gifts for folks who contribute. And for those who have, I think we have almost 4,200 or 300 people who have contributed. I want to thank all of you guys. We wouldn't be here without that. And if you have a social media network, either your own site or get on other people's sites, if you can post our link and get the word out, not only about the crowdfunding page, but the film, you'll see we post a new little clip every week. One's coming out tomorrow that focuses on both the app and the movie, and you can share those links with all your social media people. So the more you guys do that, the more we'll be able to get the word out. So that's just what I wanted to say in an introductory way. Dr. Targ, I want to thank you a little bit about, why don't you share, folks, a little bit about your background as a physicist and how you got involved in remote viewing and the science of consciousness.
Well, I was a laser physicist for about 15 years. I did graduate work at Columbia, and then I was fortunate enough to be invited to take part in the earliest developments of the laser. It was in 1958. So I was working on lasers before there were any lasers. Mm-hmm. And I did that for 15 years. And the end of my laser career, I built a giant 1,000-watt laser, which no one had ever seen before.
Wow.
Well, I don't want to talk like our president, but it was the largest laser that anyone had ever seen. Mm-hmm. And that was time for me to pursue what had been my passion all my life. I did magic as a teenager. on the stage pretending to look into the distance and read people's minds. And then when I was about 16, I entered college and realized that people really did parapsychology for a living. And in addition to fake magic, as I was doing, there were people who were studying, looking into the distance, looking into the future. And I sort of gave up my stage career and eventually had the idea I'd like to start a program. So 15 years after the laser stuff, I then started a program at Stanford Research Institute with my colleague Harold Putoff, who was also a laser guy.
Right.
The two laser guys convinced the CIA and NASA to give us money to start a program investigating psychic abilities.
Mm-hmm.
And that started in 1972. So since 72, my career has been, how do you sit with a person and help put them in touch with their own psychic abilities? Because we were supported by the CIA and the Army and right up to the Secretary of Defense,
right,
who would come and sit with me and say, well, we're supporting your program. I want to see something psychic here at SRI. Who's going to do the remote viewing? And I said, well, you are, sir. Because if I brought in Ingo Swann or Pat Price and he described where your major was hiding, you would think it's a trick. But if I sat here and showed you how to do it, and you had the experience of describing what it looked like where your major was, and we would take you, you would go back to Washington with your own experience.
Correct.
That's and great. I did that and that was my job. My job was to sit in the dark for 20 years and show people how to get in touch with their psychic abilities.
Right. And I like that analogy because that's a lot of what I tell people we're doing with Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. Instead of everyone being dependent on me doing that with them, I'd prefer people to learn what the nature of the conscious mind is and what non-locality in consciousness really implies, and begin to practice it and have those experiences themselves, because it's a universal faculty, let's call it. It's a universal ability of all sentient, conscious, intelligent beings to be able to calm the mind, to center, and to sense or see or intuit something at a distance. And in this case, because we're dealing with very advanced civilizations that are also conscious and sentient, to communicate with them. So that's a big part of my whole emphasis, is trying to, like you did for the gentleman from the military, teach them to do it, and then they realize it's legitimate because they have their own experiences. So that's a really, I didn't know that part of how all that started, but that's exactly, I think, the correct approach rather than it being all didactic.
So in the beginning, in 1972, I was a parapsychologist, psychic researcher working for the CIA. And during the Cold War, we had to find missing hostages, downed airplanes, all sorts of things. The film that I made that you've seen, Third Eye Spies, opened with a recitation by Jimmy Carter about how we found a downed Russian airplane in Africa, and nobody could find it because it was under the canopy. So even though we had wonderful satellite photography, they couldn't find it. But a lady psychic in California was able to mark up a map, put down the coordinates. The CIA launched a helicopter into Zaire, and where they landed the helicopter, natives were dragging the fragments of the airplane out of the river right in front of where the CIA landed their helicopter.
Right.
So that was and we did that for 2 decades.
Right.
But I'm no longer doing psychic research. I'm back to being a psychic entertainer. And my gig now is I will tell people about psychic abilities and show them our slides from what I did. And then I will end up saying, and let me show you how we did that.
Right.
So now I'm back on the stage doing magic, except for doing real magic.
Real magic, yeah.
Because I often scare my producer by saying, and let me tell you, if there's anybody in this big audience that doesn't have a psychic experience or see something psychic, we'll give you all your money back.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, oh my God, are you sure you want to do that? And in 2 decades, they've never had to give anybody their money back.
Right.
Because what I'm asking them to do apparently is a natural ability. And I can give you the magic words. I just tell people I have an interesting object hidden away in the box on the stage.
Right.
And all I want you to do is tell me about the surprising images that show up in your awareness right now. Don't guess what it is. Guessing is the worst thing in the world.
Correct.
Memory and imagination are a kind of psychic noise. And I am showing you, my lesson for today is to show you how to separate the psychic image from the mental noise. And we know how to do that. And we have amazing results. So
tell me a little bit about what you do for when with people to do that, to get that kind of clarity.
And I just have to get them to suspend their disbelief, give up trying to guess.
Right.
And they will. What I've learned, the thing that's been known for 2,000 years, is Padmasambhava, who's over my shoulder here on the left side, wearing a scarf. He wrote a book called Self-Liberation Through Seeing with Naked Awareness. And he wrote that 1,200 years ago.
Right.
And he said, if you're looking for self-liberation, moving into timeless awareness, which is who you are, then you have to give up your desire to name things and grasp things. And that was his language in the 800s. So 1,200 years ago, he already knew that you could quiet your mind, move your awareness into distant space-time. You just have to give up naming things. And that's what I'm still doing on the stage as an opportunity to give people the experience, and then they can do that. And it's no, you don't have to pay me thousands of dollars for a week-long workshop. Just sit down and tell me what you're experiencing. And that's all there is to it. And I did that with generals and army officers and famous scientists.
Right.
And it turned out to be not so hard.
So how do you, what do you tell them about making that distinction? Because a lot of people, when they do this, they'll say, well, I don't know if that's my imagination or I'm guessing, or if it's something I'm actually legitimately sensing.
Well, I make a pretty demanding situation that I'm sitting there across the table. He said, here's your paper, here's a pen. Joe has been taken away somewhere and I have no idea where it could be. It'll be an interesting place. Make a little sketch of the surprising image that shows up.
Right.
He says, well, I don't see anything. I say, well, that's all right. Just draw the surprising thing that shows up. And I once had a famous physicist, Yakin Aronov, who's an Israeli physicist who will probably get a Nobel Prize pretty soon. And he was brought in as a kind of oversight person because everyone trusts him at SRI. And Hal, my colleague, and Aronov's friend went to hide somewhere. And Aronov said, I don't know anything. I don't know about you, Russell. When I close my eyes, it's dark. And I said, well, they're coming. They're getting ready to come back now. I know you don't see anything, but for the experiment, just make up something. Pretend you see something. And I didn't say the word like free associate. I just said, pretend you see something. We have to get something on the paper. And so it's really a demand situation. Right. And I'm the boss. So I say, draw some damn thing, get it on the paper. So he said, well, I see some kind of ducks. My mother used to have a duck farm in Israel. I said, that's great. Draw me a duck. And he did that. And Hal came back with Aronov's partner, and they'd gone to a duck pond 5 miles away by the airport in Palo Alto. Right. And that's how I made my living for 20 years at SRI. That I got very proficient at doing that particular magic trick. And we had very great success. My last group at SRI were 6 Army officers from Fort Meade, intelligence officers, and my job was to show.
So they were a national security agency, probably.
National Security Agency.
Right.
And I had to teach those 6 guys how to do remote viewing. And then they went back to Fort Meade and created an Army Psychic Corps, and that ran for a decade. Right. And the famous, most prodigious viewer of that group was Joe McMoneagle, who was a warrant officer, chief warrant officer. And he was as competent as our great psychic police commissioner, Pat Price, or Ingo Swann, who invented remote viewing in the modern era. Ingo saved us from guessing cards and doing things that don't really work. Ingo said, I can focus my attention anywhere on the planet or off, so I'm not going to do card guessing. What you're asking me to do is a trivialization of my ability.
Right.
I'm going to go to do.
Right.
So he said, well, why don't you just go hide someplace in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'll tell you what it looks like. So we had a artist draw 60, just collect 60 locations and put them in a file, secure file that we didn't have a safe that we didn't have a key to. So each day, Hal would go to the safe, use a random number generator to get an envelope, and then go to that location. And whoever was the viewer for that day would sit with me, and I would say, well, Hal and your major have gone to hide someplace. Tell me what you see. And they did excellently. So I had 6 Army officers who were statistically significant at odds of 1 in a million.
Right.
They were control people. They had never done it before.
Right. And these were not people who had done a lot of meditation practice and things of this sort.
Absolutely not. These are intelligence officers from Fort Meade.
Right.
And what we're asking them to do is something that had been understood for 2 millennia, since the beginning of Buddhism, or 500 years after the beginning of Buddhism, at the time of Christ, and many people in between have written about it. The person that I find most interesting to talk about here is Longchenpa, who wrote a book called The Basic Space of Phenomena. And the reason I have that book is it sounds like a physics book. It doesn't sound like metaphysics. And Longchenpa was a 12th century remote viewing meditation genius. There was the earlier people like Padmasambhava, who brought Buddhism to Tibet, was really a Hindu. So if you read his writings, they're full of multi-armed deities doing various manifestations. There are no 8-armed people in Longchenpa. Longchenpa is telling you the basic space of phenomena, how your true nature is timeless awareness.
Right.
If you think that who you are is what you see in the mirror in the morning, you're in for a lot of suffering. And I think most people can experience that.
Right.
Because who you are is this timeless awareness. So you can quiet your mind in any meditation time, or riding on the streetcar, or doing whatever you're doing. You can quiet your mind and move into the spacious realms, which is where your work often takes you. And a person can become very skillful at moving into the starry night, the spacious realm. Carl Jung wrote about that in his famous Dreams, Memories, and Reflections.
Right.
And what he describes is really an out-of-body experience where he moved out into the universe and could see stars and could even look back and see the Earth. And he wrote that, in the 1930s. And It's really an early out-of-body, off-the-planet remote viewing. And he didn't call it remote viewing, of course. He just called it spacious awareness. And what we find is that this timeless awareness is independent of distance and independent of time. So the
Correct.
most interesting thing that I can tell you now is that in a decade of collecting data with Army officers and famous psychics, doing hundreds of trials, what we know for a fact is that it's no harder to describe something in China or in Soviet Siberia than it is to describe something across the street. So physicists would call this a non-local ability, in that it is absolutely no degradation in accuracy or reliability describing a weapon shop in Russia or a atomic bomb test in the future in China. And that's what we're doing for the CIA. They would come and say, what's going on at these coordinates, or what will happen at these coordinates 3 days from now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we supported ourselves. Right. And every year they expected us to continue to work with people. I was not a viewer, incidentally. I was a facilitator. My job was I was an interviewer. As an interviewer, I'm between the target and the viewer. I'm trying to bring the viewer to the target. Mm-hmm. And you see, the CIA paid me to sit in the dark for a decade. So my spiritual development was really paid for by the CIA, a very unusual situation. So I got very skillful at helping people make this disjunction between what they see in the mirror and who they really are, which is timeless awareness.
Well, and what you said about if you can see it whether it's across the street or in China, by extension, you can apply that, although it's harder to verify it until there's some confirmation event that happens. What's happening at a star system in the Andromeda galaxy, 2.5 million light years.
We would generally get feedback after our trial.
Right.
So
and that's what's very important. I want to interject here. When we're training people to do the CE5 initiative, I always point out, if you want to do some training, you need to pick something that can be objectively verified when you're working with your team, and have someone who's sort of the facilitator, and have someone and the others that are have a target, but it's controlled, and so you can get an answer. Because if you're always saying, well, we're going to remote view something that has no ability to objectively verify, the person trying to develop their skills doesn't get any feedback that they can count on. So that's why it's very important that there be some controls set up so that people can practice their conscious abilities and then have some verification of and feedback, so that they, what I call, to develop the ring of truth. In other words, where as you practice this, what I have found since I was a teenager and began to have these experiences was that when you get something that's I call it a hit, a lock on, something that's it has a certain feel to it that resonates, as opposed to a random imagination or something from your memory or guessing. So you begin to get a refinement of your own truthometer, your truth meter, as to is that correct or not correct? So that it can develop into an iterative back and forth process that becomes more and more honed and accurate over time.
But that feedback is not necessary. See, the people in the laboratory with me would always get feedback because I wanted them to learn what it feels like. But when they moved off to Fort Meade and were looking for the downed airplane or the Russian trawler or the contraband drugs or whatever they were doing, they frequently were not given feedback because they were not cleared for what they were out to describe. That is, if somebody was kidnapped, General Dozier was kidnapped in Italy, and Joe McMoneagle described where he was, and Joe didn't get feedback for years because he was not cleared to get feedback on that. And that didn't matter at all.
I'm saying you can do it that way, but if you're getting feedback, then that's how you begin to increase the trust in yourself.
That's right. You can't learn anything without feedback.
Right. And so that's where, I'm not saying it's dependent, but when you're a student wanting to develop this ability, it's very important to set up situations where you do get feedback and where you do
Absolutely.
realize,
Feedback is essential for learning.
yes.
And the most interesting thing that I can tell you in this little get together is that looking into the future is just as easy as describing something in the present.
Correct.
When Longchampa was talking about timeless awareness as your nature, he wasn't making a metaphor. He wanted you to know. In fact, he said specifically in the book that I showed that as you're able to move into timeless awareness, which is where he resides, there is no cause and effect for your consciousness. And I was shocked to find that somebody in the 12th century was talking about free of cause and effect. That seemed like a very contemporary 19th century idea. And he said, no, there's no cause and effect because your consciousness is outside of time.
Right.
And that's a very, very advanced view, pre-relativistic view. And the idea is, I once wrote a book called Limitless Mind. And what I had in mind is that a person could quiet their mind and describe anything on the planet. And then toward the end of our time with Ingo Swann, we also had a contract to do research with an ESP teaching machine, which is now available at no charge from the iTunes store. It's called ESP Trainer. So I'm fishing in my pocket for this application that started our program. The program started
It you just put into your search on the store ESP Trainer.
That's right. So this is the gadget I had.
Okay.
This is a 4-choice trainer. And I had that with me at a conference where I met Werner von Braun. And von Braun did extremely well with this 4-choice ESP trainer. You could even hear it beep in the background. And he then took me to Jim Fletcher, the administrator of NASA. Mm-hmm. And von Braun said, Targ has built some lasers for us, so I know that he knows something. And this ESP teaching machine seems to work because I'm getting very good scores. Why don't you give him some money? So that was the first money we got on our program. Mm-hmm. So our first money came because von Braun had a psychic grandmother and scored well with my ESP teaching machine.
Very interesting. What year was that, in the early 70s or mid 70s?
1972.
72.
Was a conference on speculative technology. And it's another long story, which I won't tell you. A whole chain of coincidences led me to this conference where I met von Braun, and that was the beginning. That was the first money we ever got for the program. And it was just a chain of amazing, unlikely things, one right after another, that I had nothing to do with. They were just things that occurred in places where I was invited to walk into. And at the end of that walk was the golden pod at the end of the rainbow. And then we started our program. That there was no further fuss. I met von Braun. He scored well on my ESP game. I was introduced to Jim Fletcher. He gave us money, and I could then go to SRI and say, we've got some dough. Let's start a program.
Great. Well, that's a very interesting genesis of that. And one of the things I like about your approach is that it demystifies.
That I was trying to tell is that your mind is not limited in the. Oh, I know what I was trying to tell you. We then had our NASA contract monitor in my office, and he turned to Ingo Swann and said, "We're about to launch our Pioneer spacecraft to Jupiter. Can you tell us anything interesting we'll find Jupiter?" And Ingo said, "Well, give me a pad of paper and I'll draw something." And what he drew is Jupiter with a ring around it. He said, "You're going to find a ring of ice crystals around Jupiter."
Right. And
my friend George Pesder said, "Well, you're thinking of Saturn, aren't you, Ingo?" And Ingo took a puff of his cigar and didn't blow the smoke in the guy's face, but that was the feeling he had. He said, "Well, I've been looking at the solar system my entire life. Believe me that I know the difference between Saturn and Jupiter. you're going to see a ring around Jupiter that no one has ever seen before.
Right.
And 8 months later, they sent us pictures of the ring of crystals around Jupiter. And that's 500 million miles away. So
this is the point I'm making about the CE5 contact app. What we're doing is telling people to calm the mind, begin to practice a remote viewing approach. That's the modern, I call it pop culture term, but in reality, it's a very ancient ability of the way of the seer, that every human who is conscious can become aware of the conscious mind in its limitless aspect. And you can not only remote view something under a controlled situation with your team in practice, or even with these technologies we have now, but you can also do it when you're in a real setting out under the sky with a group of people, and remote view what's out in space. But the part of this that's very interesting, and this is where this term WSFM comes from. It's a term used at the CIA for weird science and frickin' magic. And my uncle's company, which was Northrop Grumman, they just called it PFM, pure fucking magic, excuse my language. But that's what it was called. And it's a whole range of sciences and technologies that go from consciousness sciences, the science of consciousness, all the way into very high voltage electromagnetic systems. And at one of the more interesting applications of that, which I wrote about in 1991, I believe, is something called technology assisted consciousness, and also consciousness assisted technologies. And that civilizations that are interstellar are also, per force, must be transdimensional, because they cannot be locked into 3D speed of light systems. But as you evolve into that kind of civilization, you have things that are at let's say, orders of magnitude beyond what Elon Musk is trying to develop with his Neuralink project, where you'd be able to think to your computer and have it do things accurately. That these civilizations that are that advanced, that are behind these UFOs, those systems are very advanced technologies that interface with consciousness in two directions. They're interfacing that where the person can have a technology that assists in the process of what they're wanting to intend to do or see with consciousness and thought, but the reverse happens as well, where they can interact with the technology and augment the functionality of a technological device with their mind and consciousness. So there's this interplay that we're beginning to have people experiment with in various ways, like Dr. John at Princeton and elsewhere, but on a level where you're talking thousands and perhaps millions of years more developed than the technologies that are, at least in a declassified way, extant on Earth today. And one of the interesting, I don't know, I wanted to ask you this. Did you ever, in 1956, there was a man I got to know, he was quite elderly when I met him in the 90s, who had developed a technology. It was sort of a headset that would facilitate and augment this innate ability for the mind to sense and receive or transmit information very accurately through non-locality. And unfortunately, there was a very advanced, unacknowledged special access project that sort of bought that out and took it into the agency, the CIA. But I got to know this man quite well. He was an electronics genius. And he had developed a number of these sort of approaches back in the late 50s to 60s. Did you ever come across that in your
Well, Andrei Puharich had made something like that as a hearing aid. Mm-hmm. But and he was interested. He sounded like your guy, but I gather he's not. Andrei had a hearing aid where you put earphones on and they put signals right into the eighth nerve. So even though your whole mechanical hearing apparatus wasn't working, you could hear things anyway. and this was the kind of hearing aid. And Puharich was very interested in psychic things, magic mushrooms, and he was Uri Geller was a protege of Puharich, right. But I knew Puharich for a long time. Now, I believe in this timeless awareness that you were talking about as a multidimensional aspect of our consciousness, where we live in a complex space-time. We're familiar with the 4 dimensions that Einstein talks about. And Minkowski, before Einstein, was aware that each of those dimensions could have a real part and an imaginary part. And my partner, Elizabeth Rauscher, who's a theoretical physicist, helped create a way to make use of this 8-dimensional space-time. We're not adding any new dimensions. We're not saying ESP is very tricky, let's add another dimension. Mm-hmm. We're saying the space-time we live in, it has the familiar 4 dimensions, and you notice that each of those is complex, has a real and imaginary part. And in the complex space-time, let's just call it, so it doesn't sound magical, in Minkowski's complex space-time, there will always be a path of 0 distance connecting any 2 points in the space-time. And that follows from the data we have with psychic research that it's just as easy to describe any point in space-time. It requires no time, and the distance doesn't matter. So most of my life, I've been comfortable talking about limitless mind. And as I become increasingly comfortable with the idea of non-duality, where we are neither finite nor infinite, early Buddhist would say you're neither finite nor not finite.
Neither this nor that, yes.
Nagarjuna would say that. So all of these people at the time of Christ suddenly become very intelligent as we finally catch up with them. But the idea, you might consider whether you can be comfortable saying, yes, of course our consciousness is infinite. There's no limit at all to what we can see out into the universe. And our data supports that. For example, somebody would say, well, how can you say something as outrageous as psychic ability is infinite? And I would say that I've done hundreds of experiments, and Bob John at Princeton has done thousands of experiments, and there are 100 other researchers who are doing remote viewing, and there's not one drop of evidence to even suggest that the accuracy and reliability falls off with distance on the planet or off the planet.
Correct.
Ingo was able to instantaneously say, oh, you're interested in Jupiter? Let me tell you about the ice crystals. So he could fling his attention 500 million miles away instantaneously. It did not take him any time. Mm-hmm. And his drawing, I wrote a book not too long ago called The Reality of ESP. And I have a picture that Ingo drew of the planet with the ice crystals together with NASA's photograph of the ice crystals. And it looks like Ingo was right there drawing what the guy asked him to draw. And nobody on the planet knew about it.
Right.
So I think that our consciousness is infinite. There's no
right.
Saying that it's limitless implies that there is some kind of limit, and you can pass that. And I think that it's more than that. I think that we have to be courageous and say that consciousness is infinite. There's no known limitation to our consciousness.
Yes, and at that level of reality, it means that every point in space and time is connected to every other point in space and time by virtue of the nature of this non-local, infinite aspect of consciousness. And this is why people you can remote view something in the here and now, or you can sense something from 10,000 years ago that later gets discovered and verified, or something into the future. And in terms of space or time, there isn't a boundary. The boundary mainly is in what Yogananda used to call the lack of spiritual adventuresomeness amongst people who sort of keep themselves in a box, and they clip their own wings. And one of the things I think we all have to at some point come around to understanding is that whatever cage we put ourselves in, we have to use the key to open that cage up. And
you can get out of that cage. That you can bring. That we've been talking about remote viewing as though it's just some sensing with your eyes, but you can bring your sensitivity or your emotionality, even your sexuality, with you on an adventure like this. You can move. And have you had personal experiences with UFOs or with aliens that you could tell us about?
Well, yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, that's
anything you'd like to tell us about?
Well, I think probably the thing that started what my path on this, where the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind started, was I had a near-death experience when I was 17. And after that near-death experience, well, during the near-death experience, I experienced consciousness in its infinite aspect. But I was raised a very devout atheist. So we didn't believe in anything. And I didn't have any religious or indoctrination from any tradition. So I had always loved space and the stars and nature. So when I had my near-death experience, I found myself out in space. And I had this oneness experience. It reminds me a lot of when I shared this experience with astronaut Edgar Mitchell, and sort of kind of similar to what he had when he was out in space and looked back to the Earth. But it was this really deep experience. Later, I realized that it was an experience of cosmic consciousness, and what I later learned would be called unity consciousness in that state. Well, of course, eventually I did a whole series of things happened during that experience. And about maybe 2 months later, on my 18th birthday, it was coincidental, I learned a type of meditation, mantra meditation, that enabled me to sort of calm my mind and get centered. And it was just a meditation technique. I wasn't trying to remote view. I wasn't trying to do anything. But I went off to college, and I went up to the mountains in North Carolina. I selected where I wanted to go to college. I could care less about academics at that point. I was interested in being in the beauty of nature. So I'd go up to this 5,000-foot mountain and meditate. And I would go one evening in October of '73, in the middle of the Yom Kippur War. I'm up there meditating. And just before I go to sit down to meditate before sunset, there is a seamless, fully materialized disc that appeared, like the one that's in the movie. That's the Vancouver Island disc by the mountain. And it's like one I had seen when I was about 8 or 9 in Charlotte, North Carolina, as a little kid. A whole bunch of the kids in the neighborhood, my twin sister, who still remembers this, saw it. But I thought, well, they're back. I didn't have any other thought about it. And it kind of vanished. So I sat and meditated. I went into this deep meditation where I gained the state of the same level of consciousness, of that unity consciousness I had during my near-death experience, which had happened 6 months earlier. And I was very deep in meditation it had to be for more than an hour, because when I finished the meditation, it was very dark, and above me was the Milky Way galaxy. And I was in there wasn't any boundary between myself and this state of unbounded infinite consciousness as an experience, even though I was awake and walking around. And so I got up, and a beautiful thought came into my mind. Behold, what a beautiful universe God has made. And even though I didn't have a particularly religious orientation. And with that, I went into that state as if I was out in space, but all in my body all at the same time. And I realized there was a glow over the crest of the mountain, and there was an object, and I wasn't sure what it was. And then there was this creature that I thought was a deer up on its hind legs, because I didn't know anything about ETs or any of this. And this creature, I don't know if it was male or female, it had beautiful, almost like deer-like eyes, and touched me on my right shoulder. And I was wearing a ski jacket. It's in October up at over 5,000 feet. And as soon as I was touched, all that hairs on my, I had this electromagnetic discharge. And I looked down, I could literally see my ski jacket indent, and could feel, to this day, I can feel that boom. And with that, I seemingly dematerialized, had this experience with these ETs on this craft. It lasted probably about 3 hours, I'm guesstimating. It didn't seem like 3 hours. And what we were really doing was sitting in meditation together. And that's when we sort of co-created these, the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind protocol techniques and the communication system.
So you didn't feel any jeopardy when you were on the spacecraft?
I'm sorry?
You didn't feel any jeopardy or fear when you were on the spacecraft?
No, not at all. None, zero. It was beautiful. Now, what was strange is that when I reappeared back on that mountaintop, so it sort of is a big, at the top, it's like a long ridge, and there was a fire tower at the top of it. And that's where I had sat to meditate. So it was at the pinnacle. And when I came back, I was about a quarter of a mile back down the gravel road that leads up to the fire tower. And I had the strangest electromagnetic field around me, where I was able to, I wasn't exactly levitating, but I was able to go like from here to the maybe 15, 20 feet with one sort of like, I would just sort of leap a little and go boom, boom, boom. And I did that all the way back down this mountain in the dark. It was very dark. I was mostly just sensing my way down. And when I got down to the town of Boone, North Carolina, I thought we had had a nuclear war, because the town was deserted. No one was out. I thought it should have been maybe 9 o'clock. And it turned out it was after midnight. And back then you got, they had, men's and women's dorms, but you had a curfew. You had to be in there at a certain time, and they locked it. So I had to wake up the resident assistant in the dorm to get me in. And I realized I had, had these 3 hours where I was in this timeless state, but there was also a trans-dimensional physical effect that happened, not the whole way down the mountain, but where I had a sort of electromagnetic field around me. So I had this sort of quasi-levitation experience as I'm going back down to town. So what I started doing, as bizarre as this sounds, I'm this 18-year-old guy. And so every night before I would go to bed, I would lay down, I would do my meditation, and then I would go into that state of consciousness and remote view where these ET craft might be, and I would then invite them to come again. And every single night I did that, the Forest Service up in this area of North Carolina mountains were reporting UFOs here and there and what have you. The reason I stopped doing it, it kind of freaked me out one night. I did this with real specificity and showing what I looked like. And I think just as a way of saying, yo, we get it. You don't have to belabor the point here. The ETs basically said, we can understand this. There was a boy driving on a road between Boone and Morganton that had a craft that appeared beside his car, and it stopped the engine. And he had this experience. And when they showed this guy who was in the newspaper, he looked like he could have been my twin brother. So it was a very strange thing. And I said, maybe I shouldn't be fooling around with this unless I have some genuinely meaningful purpose. So I didn't do it again for about 2 years. And
so you had a good indoctrination.
Yeah, it was a tutorial. I'm 18 years old. I didn't understand anything about the science of consciousness, really. I'd learned a meditation technique. And I was not raised steeped in sort of mysticism and ESP. And I mean, my family, if it didn't fit into a test tube, it didn't exist. End of discussion. So we're very linear, material, reductionist thinking. So this was quite an eye opener for me as a young boy or young man.
Yeah, this is very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Pat Price was the most psychic person we ever worked with, psychic police commissioner who could essentially describe anything you wanted to know instantaneously. And he was very interested in UFOs. And one day he laid out a big atlas for us that he drew with UFO bases. There's one at Mount Hayes in Alaska, another one in South America, someplace, another one near an army base in Australia, and another one in the Pyrenees. Mm-hmm. And I understand Mount Hayes still is a site where people see UFOs. Mm-hmm. And the CIA was very interested in the one he had in Australia because he said that's something that they have their eyes on. And this was part of our lunchtime conversation. Mm-hmm. Price was very, very interested in UFOs.
Right.
And he asked me, have you ever visited one? And of course, nothing could have been further from my life, my thoughts. But I was pretty experienced as a remote viewer at that time.
Right.
So I went home in the evening, and as I was doing a sort of bedtime meditation, just sort of like an out-of-body experience. That in remote viewing, you can go, very briefly, in remote viewing, you can go to a distant place, open the door, turn on the lights, go inside, go down the stairs. You have quite mobility at the target, we would say.
Right.
So in this case, I thought I would just move out into space, as I had already read that Carl Jung had done. I had the idea that I could move from my bed out into space, and I did that, and I was looking for a UFO.
Right.
This would be 1973. And I went out into space, which was increasingly black, and I came upon something which was truly enormous. We see pictures of UFOs, and they look like automobile size. The thing that I came upon was like destroyer size or battleship size, huge expanse of curvy material.
Right.
And I just drifted inside because I was very familiar with how that would be. That I wasn't fearful. I was quite accustomed working with my psychic pal Hella Hammond. We would often, she would go someplace and say it's dark, and I turn on the lights for her. So I was quite accustomed to visiting distant places where I have mobility. And I went into this place, and I came upon a whole row of things that looked like beds, and there were some kind of creature, bodies, under hair dryers. So there were like 12, 15 bodies in a row, all under hair dryers. And I walked to the end of that, and I then heard some noise occurring, and that frightened me because I obviously had no idea what was going on. Nobody invited me in, and I heard this kind of grinding sound, and I thought it was a good time to get out of here. I had that experience. Hella and I were once in Brezhnev's office in the Kremlin psychically, and we then went down into a computer bay, and I just became fearful. It's the idea that I had a lot of clearances, but I didn't have clearance to be in the computer bay in the Kremlin. And I just had this flash of paranoia. Let's get the hell out of here. And that was my feeling here. And when I told Pat Price about that experience, he said, "You're lucky you got out of there before they grabbed your consciousness and they just find you dead in your bed at home. You had good judgment to leave."
Because in Brezhnev's, the Soviet Union. Yeah.
That's right. You gotta, if you're going to be a traveling psychic, you gotta know, it's like you gotta know when to hold them and when to fold them.
Well, luckily, the interstellar civilizations don't have, they've evolved past the point where that would be an issue. However, there's an interesting distinction here, and that is an out-of-body experience versus being centered in deeper or more quiet aspects of consciousness, where you're actually still very much your let's call it your so-called astral body, or your body of light that people talk about traveling with, and your physical body are still all together, but the consciousness, sort of the field consciousness that you're connected and identifying to, is at that distant place, even though there's not a separation of the physical and so-called etheric or astral body. And that's where,
in an out-of-body experience, you generally have feelings associated with what's going on in that location.
yeah, it's more tactile often. It's more like actually being there.
And you can communicate with somebody at the distant place. They're aware that you're present.
Yes. Well, it depends on their conscious evolution. They may be aware of you even without your so-called astral or body of light out-of-body experience. And I like telling the story. You know, my wife and I were doing we have 4 daughters. And for our anniversary one year, we got a nanny for a few days, and we went down to Costa Rica. And we were, it was a beautiful setting on the Pacific coast, and we were staying at this little modest motel along the ocean. And I love the ocean, and I love that kind of aquamarine water and green, and it just, so that night I went to sleep, and I was doing a meditation, and I went into sleep time, and I wanted to go travel over the water. So I left my body, but my wife had awakened just at the instant, and she said what it looked like was, and she was sort of very still, half asleep, so she was sort of had more relaxed, I guess her intellect and filters were down a little. So she looked and she saw this sort of silver gray thing that looked like my shape, that sat up and left my body and flew out the window. Well, she saw that at the same instant. I was flying out over the water, and I was seeing everything, even though it was pitch dark, as if it was with the most perfect celestial, crystal clear light. Now, she was back in the bed thinking I had died. She thought I was dead because she saw my spirit leave. So she was thinking, oh my God, I'm stuck here in Costa Rica. I have 4 children at home, and my husband has just died. And she was really worried. And of course, after I had done my little adventure, I come back. She by then she's awake enough, she doesn't see me re-enter my body. But I as I'm laying there, I feel that I'm being watched, and I realize Emily is awake and looking at me. And I look over, and she says, "You're back." I said, "Back? I haven't gone anywhere." She says, "Oh, yes, you did." And she describes what she saw, and the time interval and everything was exactly while I was out on my little journey flying around exploring the Costa Rican coast, the Pacific coast. And that is when I realized that if someone is in a relaxed enough state of mind, even their physical eyes can pick up this sort of subtle presence in energy.
So it says if you are going to journey outside of your body, but with your consciousness, it's good to be vigilant.
Yes, right. So anyway, so I think that's a really another important part of this is and you and I spoke about this before, the amazing abilities that and experiences people can have about remote places or the future in a lucid dream, where they're asleep. They're not having necessarily an out-of-body experience, but they're asleep and they intuit or see something from the future, whether it's the next day or a month or 2 away. And I think I mentioned to you that I met my wife that way. I was in Haifa, Israel, and I had these 5 dreams in a row, night after night, where in the dream that was very 3D, very full color, there was a very enlightened man who would come to me and introduce me to this woman and said, "This is who you should marry." and gave me all kinds of information. She's going to be older than you. She's going to come from far away and then leave, but it will work out and don't worry and all this. It was very detailed. And so I was with a friend and I said, I need to see who this person is. Now I'm 22. I have no interest in being married at that point. But sure enough, I guess maybe a couple months later, she comes to Israel. She was in the Peace Corps. She comes to Israel for a conference, and we're up in these gardens up on top of Mount Carmel. And I see her walk through the gate. I turned to my friend. I said, that's her. But what are you going to do? You're going to go up to a complete stranger like a madman and say, hey, I saw you in this dream. But so I didn't say anything. So we sort of talked.
A new line. I never heard that before.
Yeah. And so I just said, well, I'm not going to do or say anything except, we talked, and maybe we talked for about an hour, and we immediately had this sort of sense that we'd always known each other. But then I said, that's it. All she had was my first name. And I did a little prayer, and I said, okay, if the Great Spirit wants me to marry this person, she's going to have to reach out to me and somehow find me, but I'm never going to reach out to her. And she was on her way. When she left Israel, she met her mom in London just for a little trip. And she felt so compelled. All she knew about me was my name was Steve, and I was from North Carolina. So she wrote to where I was working and said, and just addressed it to that address, Steve from North Carolina. And the letter got to me. And after that, we sort of corresponded. Back then, there was no internet. This is 1978. And after a few back and forths, I told her this story I'm now sharing with you guys. And she just felt, yes, that's right. So we literally said, okay, let's have a courtship. So we went to Alaska for 10 days, had an old-fashioned courtship, and got married. And that was 41 years ago.
Well, congratulations.
So that's, I tell people that these abilities that you develop, they have all kinds of applications for your personal life, professional life, and that we need to kind of demystify it and let people know that this capability to be awake in the state of consciousness that it is infinite and not contained space and time box is extremely useful and practical. And although I wouldn't admit it when I was a practicing ER doctor, resulted in me having the knowledge of things not yet seen that saved a number of lives.
That's a wonderful story. I'd like to put the cap on my story when I talked about going to Brezhnev's office with Hella. I was describing that as though
oh, yes. And by the way, for people who don't remember, Brezhnev was the head
of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
2 years later, I had left SRI, and I was lecturing. I was a guest of the Soviet Academy of Sciences in Moscow, in the Kremlin. And they said, it's a very interesting story. I guess if that's true, we can't hide anything anymore. And everybody was very excited about that in the Kremlin. They said, is there anything you'd like to see as long as you're here? And I said, oh, yes, I'd like to see Brezhnev's office. I don't have to see Brezhnev. I just like to see where he sits. And Hella's description of Brezhnev's office exactly corresponded to what she drew and what I saw. So I had a chance to get feedback of a large desk on the right and windows on the left. I did not ask to go behind the desk and see the computer room, but her description as an out-of-body experience, and I had to open the door for her and turn on the lights. So our little Fantasyland trip at SRI was exactly what I got to experience 6,000 miles later and 2 years in the future. So this was a case where I had this out-of-body experience with Hella, and I got perfect feedback for it. So it was not it gives some reality to these things that we see.
Exactly. It gives you a validation. I shared this story before. I don't know, it may be in one of the books I've written about this person who came into the emergency department who had been to, I haven't shared this one, but she had been to many, many specialists because she was having very strange visual problems. And she'd been to neurologists, ophthalmologists. She finally came in to the ER, not in an emergency, but just distressed that nobody would take her seriously. And I was examining her, and she didn't have any objective, findings neurologically or ophthalmology. But I could see that she had a brain tumor in a specific area of the brain. And so I got a CAT scan, which today I probably would be punished for getting, because there weren't objective findings to warrant the expense. But in those days, and maybe still, in the emergency setting, you can just order it and there's no review. You just order it, you get it, and it's done. It's not like going through a bunch of fascists at the health insurance company or Medicare. So we got this back, and it turned out she had this tumor that everyone had not thought possible, that was exactly in the area of the brain, centrally, not in the optic nerve or the eye, where it was impinging and growing into areas, giving her all manner of visual disturbances and triggering all kinds of visual effects. And, unfortunately, it had continued to grow. Of course, she was referred to neurosurgery and what have you in oncology, but she lived. But it was one of those things where I tell people that you can combine your objective senses, your five senses, and your scientific knowledge and your training in whatever your area is, and add to it this mental capability, this ability for the conscious mind to sense and see and know things, and they can then work together. And we live in a time where everything has to be separated. In this reductionist world, you're either a mystic or you're a scientist, but you can't be someone who's a conscious, awake scientist. And that, I think, as we go into the future, that's going to be a real change in our society, when we learn that we can be both scientifically advanced, but also consciously advanced.
I think doctors are getting more permission to do that than they used to. I know more than one doctor who says, well, when I see somebody walk in my office, I scan them before I do anything. I just look at them and get a sense of where the problem lies.
There should be a course in medical school.
That would be a very good idea.
Yeah. Someday maybe that'll happen. Now, you mentioned before we started, behind your shoulder, there's a drawing on the wall that we wanted to talk about. That's interesting.
I was doing a series of remote viewings with Pat Price, the great psychic, and our task was to find what it looked like where Hal Puthoff was as he traveled through South America. He was on vacation, and each day at noon, Pat Price would sit with me in our little shielded room, and it would say, I see something, it looks like a harbor, or it looks like a cathedral, or it looks like a market, or it looks like a volcano. And on day 5, he didn't show up. So this was an important series of experiments. This is the first formal series of long-distance experiments we did. Hal was at Colombia and was 2,000 miles away in South America. And so Price never showed up. So I'm sitting there with my tape recorder, and I record. This is a remote viewing with Russ Targ and Pat Price. We're describing where Hal Puthoff is, but Price isn't here, so I'll describe what I see. And what I saw was a airport on an island, and I drew an airport, a runway, and I said there's sand and grass on the right, an airport building on the left, an ocean at the end of the runway. And if you can blow that picture up, you'll see that I even wrote sand and grass on the right, ocean at the end of the runway, and that's exactly where he was. In our film, in Third Eye Spies, Hal confesses that he thought he would trick the great psychic Pat Price, because Price knew that he was in an interior country in Colombia, and Price and Hal got a flight out to this island called San Andreas to see, could Price actually follow the airplane out to the island.
Right.
Price wasn't there, but it shows that psychic functioning is so easy that even a scientist can do it. That I just had to sit down, close my eyes. I saw the runway and I made a drawing of it. And that's as sharp a drawing as anything we've seen in our program. I don't put myself forward as a psychic. This is just an interesting demonstration to give the idea that this kind of psychic functioning is not that hard to do. If you rise to the occasion, it's a kind of demand. And as I described earlier, with the scientist who couldn't see anything, I just said, okay, make something up. Mm-hmm. Your consciousness will tell you what to draw.
Right. And people can do this, when we're doing the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind out under the stars, or you can do it before you go out. You can just say, you put that demand on yourself and you say, this is what I'm going to intend to do. And you take that seriously, and you can develop this function with a team of people. I recommend that people do this with 3 to 8 people. It doesn't have to be a large group at all, but that you develop that. And of course, in this case, we're doing not just sensing and remote viewing, but we're also flipping that around, where we're also then connecting to those life forms and asking them to come to where we are. And there's a very, very high correlation to us doing that, and various types of UFO phenomenon and ET phenomenon happening around us, which, by the way, we have like 100 terabytes of this sort of stuff. And you see in this 2-hour movie a few things, but it's so much material and so many different types of phenomenon. And the other thing that I tell people that's equally interesting is events that happen where they respond to your invitation, and it may not be particularly safe for them to come in 3D, but they may come in something closely approximating what we were talking about with an out-of-body experience. But you can take an entire spacecraft, and it can shift resonantly from its aspect that is material, let's call it 3D solid, into something that approximates our astral body. And that doesn't have the limitations of the speed of light. And now we're starting to talk a little bit more about what the interstellar technologies entail, but it's done technologically and can be reproduced. And so many people get into this debate, well, are these things interdimensional or are they extraterrestrial? I said, well, by definition, the ones that are ET, if they're here, have to be interdimensional. You cannot travel just at the speed of light 2.5 million light years from the Andromeda galaxy. Like that ambassador that appeared at Joshua Tree National Park a few years ago that we have the photograph of that's in the movie, that ambassador was from Andromeda, and his name is Bijou, and he introduced himself very specifically. And a lot of the back and forth, the way we would get validation, we were out there with magnetic field detectors that pick up variations in the magnetic field that you zero out in the wilderness to the baseline magnetic field. And whenever we would ask something, the ET would then signal in a binary, beep or 2 beeps, yes, no, about what we were asking.
What did the ambassador communicate that he wanted? What did he let you know why he's here?
Yes, he was here to establish an open contact with humans. But one of the key points I make to people is that there aren't people in the military and the United Nations or the foreign ministries of governments or our State Department who are doing this properly. Therefore, we need some pioneers that are humans doing it until our governmental officials approach this in a way that isn't militaristic and violent, and or based on sort of some kind of strange paranoia and war footing. And that's one of the real crises that we're facing right now. I mean, I briefly mentioned it on Fox News last night, but we only had a couple minutes with Laura Ingraham. But one of the big concerns I have is we're already in a post-global moment. I tell people that sort of the global mindset would have been quaint and sort of avant-garde in 1910 or 1920 or 30. We're already at a stage where there are intelligent civilizations concerned about our development as we've developed nuclear weapons, et cetera, and so on. And they're here, but they're wanting what in the military is called a POC, a point of contact. Well, what's their point of contact going to be? People who want to approach them with a electromagnetic pulse weapon system, or humans that want to open up a dialogue out of a sense of commonality in conscious, intelligent life in the cosmos. So we're trying to answer that. So this ambassador made it very clear they came, and there are all kinds of cool phenomena that happened right before that. It's not in the movie, but we were actually in circle. Maybe 30, 40 people were out. And we've been doing the sort of meditation and remote viewing and the CE5 invitation protocols for a couple hours. And so we took a break, and I walked to the east, down the east from that site at the Geology Tour Road in Joshua National Park, if you ever go there. And when I was down there with a few people on the team with me, suddenly there was this sphere, almost like a size of a grapefruit, that materialized right beside my right shoulder. And I saw it, and everyone saw it. And it came into this dimension and then folded into space-time and vanished. And I turned to everyone, I said, they're here. And so I had a Tibetan prayer bowl that I rang to get everyone back in circle. And as we were gathering in circle, we heard 4 or 5 voices speaking in the desert very clearly, because now everyone's very quiet. But where I had military grade, you have to do the Homeland Security paperwork to get these night vision scopes. And I was looking exactly where these 4 or 5 people were talking. And there was nothing there with the visible naked eye. They were cloaked. But I asked someone sitting beside me, Raven, who's in the documentary, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. I said, Raven, right there, take a photograph. So she just held her breath and took a photograph. And there's this ambassador from the Andromeda galaxy floating right outside where our chairs are and waving to us. Now, that is an unretouched photograph. I was there, I saw it, but no one ever saw that person with their 3-dimensional eyes. We all heard them.
How did you learn he's from Andromeda?
Because we asked where he was from, and when I was telepathically told where he was from, I asked, signal through our magnetic field detector system whether this is correct or not. And so we did a whole dialogue for maybe 45 minutes going back and forth that way. But intuitively, I was receiving the information quite accurately, but I wanted the group to be able to hear a very specific confirmation utilizing the magnetometer that we had out in the field. And so that's what we do. There are a whole lot of systems where we have going simultaneously. And that's one of them. We have electronic systems, but that experience, what it taught a lot of people who were there is that, and then after that, there was all this phenomenon in the sky above us, but at a safe distance. And at one point, I think we had 12 UFOs moving like objects in a petri dish, or moving almost like organically above us up near Orion, that we actually got a great videotape of. But they were very high and very small, but they were, moving in various directions, and there are a number of them. So the other thing I wanted to share with you about this remote viewing, you mentioned Ingo Swann with Jupiter. I don't know, you know what NORAD is, the North American Air Defense Command, Cheyenne Mountain in near Colorado Springs. And, it's hardened facility inside a mountain. And some years before I met this man who had worked there, I had this experience with one of our CE5 teams where we went out into our solar system, and it was somewhere out near Saturn. There was a artificial object that was enormous, not thousands of feet across, miles across. And I couldn't quite get the scale of it, but I sensed that it was, a couple dozen miles in diameter, one object. And one of my military advisors back in the 90s, when I was doing these briefings for the CIA director and the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and people like that, I described this object, and he just looked stunned. And he said, well, I was at Cheyenne Mountain years ago, and there was an area, it was Console 50, that's in a classified area where they tracked the interstellar vehicles that are near Earth or out in our solar system that come and go. And he said that he was in that room. And this is such a sensitive area that if he was there once when someone on the outside of the corridor inside the mountain leaned on the wall, German shepherds and guys with, M16s instantly appeared to get rid of that person. So it was to be read into that area, it was a very high classification. It was an unacknowledged special access project area within Cheyenne Mountain. And I've been there, but he said that they were in there and they had tracked. Now, this is a Navy intelligence guy, so this is kind of funny, but they had tracked an object out in our solar system out there that was 26 miles in diameter. And I'm quoting, moving under its own steam. And I said, well, I'm not sure they're using steam. However, so that was interesting, because that was years later a confirmation of what we had seen and had a connection with this out in our solar system, but out in deep space. This vehicle it didn't seem like it could be an accurate remote view because it was so huge. It seemed ridiculous. I mean, that would be the size of the whole LA basin. But it was real. And I later had it confirmed by this man with a TS SCI clearance who was read into these unacknowledged special access projects, USAPs, that in fact there was such an object. And I later found out that some of the
if you have control of a technology that allows you to make a transition through space and time, you can build the thing as big as you want.
Yes, because there's no the normal variations of weight and velocity, et cetera, and so on. That goes away once you attain that level of technological understanding of non-locality, and also the nature of space, time, matter, and the consciousness field, all of it woven together. We tend to think of the material cosmos as being something separate from what we've been talking about today with consciousness and let's call it the astral concept, the out of body of light. But the ancient, if you look at the writings in the ancient Sanskrit and the Vedas, that understanding is all this is that, meaning everything that exists is actually conscious field phasing and resonating as that object or as a photon or a star. So there's this
the world of non-duality.
It's the non-duality. And of course, we're so trained in duality, but in reality, our intellectual constructs don't necessarily match the nature of reality.
And that's what you're describing as neither material nor not material.
Correct.
And people have a hard time with that.
Right. Well, but but
that's our nature.
It's our nature.
We're neither finite nor infinite. Our bodies are finite, governed by Einstein's force space, but our consciousness is infinite.
Right. And there's an interplay between the consciousness and the conscious body of light and the physical body that explains what they call the siddhis, S-I-D-D-H-I-S, which include teleportation, levitation, et cetera, and so on. So one of the points I make to people is that whatever we have understood in, say, our mystical literature or the experience of humanity with people who had very highly developed skills in consciousness, there is a technological correlation to that when you're dealing with advanced interstellar civilizations. So the things that we read about, say in Yogananda's book, or the siddhis, the ability to teleport or bilocate, every one of those abilities and powers that we ascribe to very advanced, consciously advanced humans or enlightened masters is actually a science and a technology in an advanced interstellar civilization. And so this gets to be something where we can, it's like Back to the Future, because the things that have been described in the literature going back, and by the way, the Vedas, we don't know how old those are. They certainly predate Buddhism, Hinduism. It's, as you know, Sanskrit is considered the root language of all Indo-European languages. So we don't know how old that is. It could be tens of thousands of years old. It was an oral tradition until relatively recently. But the knowledge that is in that tradition very much deals with the fact that all of this, all the cosmos and three-dimensional material world is actually consciousness itself. And there is no separation or duality. It's just how we are perceiving it.
Well, Buddhists in the Buddhist writing and the Prajnaparamita, all throughout that is the idea that there is no separation in consciousness. Consciousness is a singular.
Right.
And
was about Schrodinger and shit.
Schrodinger said that consciousness is a singular of which there is no plural.
Yeah, it is. It kind of also reminds me of the Sufi saying, knowledge is a single point, but the foolish have multiplied it. Well, look, it's getting late. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Targ. And again, his movie, if you guys, it's on Amazon Prime, right? It's called Third Eye Spies.
Third Eye Spies is streaming on Amazon.
Great. So I saw it before it got released, and I think you did a great job with it. And it's a great review of the history and the evolution of remote viewing and your experience with it with the CIA and others.
Thank you. And one of the magical things about the streaming on Amazon is you can watch the film and it doesn't cost anything.
Well, as long as you belong to Amazon Prime. Right, exactly.
So our movie is called Third Eye Spies.
Yes, very good. Well, thank you again for being with us. And to everyone listening, I hope you guys will visit us at ce5film.com. Take a look at this film that's out now, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. And I hope you'll join us and subscribe to this channel now that we're sort of under quasi house arrest. We'll be, I'll try to be doing these more often than I used to, since I can't get out amongst you. We'll just do things from our living room. That sounds good.
Very happy to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
So I have one. Can I talk to you?